There we go. All right, we'll give it just a minute or two to allow folks to join. Maybe everyone won't be as punctual this evening as I am expecting them to. But we'll give it a moment or two. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Well, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jessica from Greenlight, and we are thrilled to host tonight's rescheduled event with Joanna Wuest presenting her new book, Born This Way: Science, Citizenship, and Inequality in the American LGBTQ+ Movement. She's going to be talking with Paisley Currah, so you are in for an excellent evening online with us tonight. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Joanna and to Paisley and to the team at University of Chicago Press for making this happen. We had an event scheduled in the store and we had to go ahead and reschedule it online. So thank you guys for staying with us for all of that. And thanks to all of you for showing up. We're grateful for all of your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. A couple housekeeping things before we get started. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see and hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first one is the chat, which you can find on by clicking on the icon that looks like a speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your support for the author and interact with fellow attendees. You can also take a look at the chat for links to the book buy page and other information I'll be dropping there throughout the evening. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A. You can find that by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program tonight. And very importantly, tonight's featured book, Born This Way, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. As thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we're offering 10% off the featured book when you buy it online. You can enter the coupon code GreenlightEvents10 into the coupon discount section at checkout for 10% off. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize that. I'll put it in the chat and you'll see it in a little bit. All right, some introductions. Our interviewer tonight is Paisley Currah. Paisley is professor of political science and women's and gender studies at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. An award-winning author, he's the Found-winning co-editor of the journal Transgender Studies Quarterly and the co-editor of Transgender Rights and Corpus. In 2022, Greenlight hosted Paisley for the launch of his latest book, Sex Is as Sex Does, so we're grateful to have him back again. He's going to be speaking tonight with our featured author, Joanna Wuest. Joanna is a political scientist, an assistant professor of politics at Mount Holyoke College, and scholar specializing in LGBTQ+ and reproductive rights, religion, and health. At Princeton University, she holds the Fund for Reunion Kotzen Postdoctoral Fellowship in LGBT Studies in the Society of Fellows of the Liberal Arts. She holds a PhD in political science with a certificate in women, gender, and sexuality studies from the University of Pennsylvania. Joanna's new book, Born This Way, tells the story of how a biologically based understanding of gender and sexuality became central to LGBTQ+ advocacy. I'll let her tell you more about it, but the result is essential reading to fully understand LGBTQ+ activism today and how clashes over science remain crucial to equal rights struggles. So Joanna's going to start off by talking a little bit about the book, and then she'll be talking with Paisley and then taking some of your questions. So Joanna, please take it away.
Well, thank you so much. I'm just so grateful to Greenlight for being able to reschedule this event that we had to cancel earlier this month. I'm super grateful to Paisley being here in conversation today, and to everyone who's able to kind of come out and listen and talk tonight. And so before Paisley and I start talking, I just wanted to lay out a few motivations for why I wrote this book. And the first is that I, like probably many folks, noticed that this Born This Way idea, this conception of LGBTQ+ identities as being essential in some sort of biological way that maybe we could know with science, was very popular. And it's been very popular for a large part of my life. And we see it all over. I think it's almost not worth saying, but most famously, Lady Gaga's disco anthem, Born This Way, kind of actually cribbing from this other disco star from the 70s, Carl Bean. And then we also see it in politics. We saw a few years ago, Justice Amy Coney Barrett's judicial confirmation hearing in the Senate, and she was kind of pounced on Senate Democrats during that nomination hearing for when she used the term sexual preference. And the Democratic senators kind of noted that preference suggests something that's less stable, less innate than the usual sexual orientation that we're so used to hearing. So we see this idea all throughout kind of culture and law and politics. And so while I was kind of curious about that idea, I noticed that there wasn't anything in the way of a comprehensive history of how that idea became so prominent in the American LGBTQ plus movement. And so what I did is I kind of went into the archives and I wrote this book that starts in the 1950s with the mainstream kind of gay and lesbian organizations that popped up during that period. And I just traced their relationships with various scientific and medical experts, from the reformist sexologist Alfred Kinsey, who kind of famously said that homosexuality is just one of many variants within the kind of natural spectrum of human sexuality. These reformists also worked with folks like Evelyn Hooker, the psychologist, who kind of in an early period in the late 1950s showed that gays and lesbians had kind of normal mental health profiles and that there wasn't any kind of innate link between same-sex desire and behavior and mental illness as it was construed at the time. And then I took that narrative all the way up until the present, and that is when these reformist scientists and these early activists stopped making arguments that they weren't sick and they weren't mentally ill and pathologically so, and rather they started to make bolder arguments with new biological sciences, and that is the kind of modern born this way idea that we're familiar with today. And then the book kind of ends looking at the persistence of the born this way idea, especially in bisexual identities, trans identities, and civil rights. And as we'll talk about later tonight, the ability of this idea to survive, even in this era when we talk about fluidity and flexibility and kind of queer desire and identities, don't sound as much like they kind of ring out in that born this way register any longer. But I'll make an argument that there still is a lot of born this way, even in this period. And then secondly, the reason I wrote this book was to give a sort of critical perspective on this born this way idea, while also not totally rejecting the idea that science and medicine can tell us important things about sexuality and gender identity. And I did that because there are some very, very good critiques of the born this way idea as it's been deployed in kind of civil rights law, as it's been deployed in just broader advocacy politics. But sometimes these critiques go a little far and they say that science can't tell us anything about these identities, or maybe it's doing more harm than good. And I'm trying to walk a bit more of a balance in taking this critical perspective on what we should expect science and medicine to be able to tell us, and the things that are kind of so far from what science has been able to kind of prove or demonstrate, that we should maybe rethink altogether. And so altogether, that's kind of my general impetus for writing this book that we're discussing tonight.
All right, so I think it's my turn to start to get this conversation going, and I just want to say like how pleased I am to be doing this. You might not care, but Joanna and I are both in political science, which is, well, I guess we'll just say, hopefully there's not too many on here. It's not the best discipline for LGBTQ stuff, or especially transgender stuff. I mean, you know, at political science conferences, I would be referred to like as an it, and that was by the gay caucus. So it's just nice to have people coming up in the field. And Joanna and I knew each other a little bit on Twitter, but like I was reviewing an essay for a journal, a blind essay, you know, a essay where I didn't know the author. And I was like, holy moly, this is a smart, incredibly good piece of work. And then I was lucky to realize later on when it came out that it was Joanna. So she is like one of the brilliant up and coming scholars of LGBTQ rights and identity. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And this is my first question is kind of funny because I just don't do science and I can't remember what XX and XY. I can't remember who goes with what. But I want to ask, what does the science of sexuality and gender actually say? Like, is there any merit to born this way claims?
Definitely. So, yeah, this born this way idea, I think, was very popularized in kind of came into the consciousness of many of us in the 1990s when this geneticist Dean Hammer purported to find something that the media quickly called a gay gene or evidence of a gay gene. In Dean Hammer's defense, what he claimed to find was that there was some location on the X chromosome that maybe determined some part of homosexuality. So it was always a bit more of a conservative claim, but it very much kind of took off and became this gay gene idea as a result of kind of media and culture and politics and law. And in all those realms, this little marker on an X chromosome exploded into this idea of born this way. And then if we zoom up to a few decades later, in 2019, we saw kind of the most cutting edge study, the largest study of the biological heritability of sexual orientation debate, or to date, kind of being published in the journal Science. And so this team led by this guy, Ghana, in 2019, found that after looking at 500,000 different individuals' genetic material, that maybe somewhere between 8 to 24, 25% could be deemed to be heritable in some respect. But then when they went to look for the kind of evidence for that heritability, they could find within the genome something like less than 1% that accounted for that 8 to 25%. And all of that is to say that this is the most high-powered study to date, made all the national news headlines, and it really didn't say that much about the biological heritability of what it means to be gay. And it certainly didn't say anything at all about what it might mean to go into an individual's human kind of genome and look for something like gay genetic material and to be potentially able to alter it, which is kind of a long-standing fear of the search for a gay gene. But I always tell folks, don't worry about it. There is absolutely kind of no chance that anyone is anywhere near discovering something like that. So that is kind of the modern state of the genetic research on born this way.
Yeah, I just as like a little extra follow up. I noticed you cite Roger Lancaster's book, which is like 20 years old now, but it's about like how no matter what a scientist does and how carefully they state the results and hedge their bets, the media just go to town with describing it. Like, did you find that was happening?
Definitely. And I've learned so much from Roger's, it's called The Trouble with Nature, right?
Yeah,
The Trouble with Nature, everyone should still buy and read that book. It's just one of the best critiques of what he calls genomania. And genomania being this kind of, the exact kind of cultural trend that takes us from something more measured like Dean Hammer's study to this idea that there is a gay genetics. We've either found a gay gene or we're very close to finding a gay gene.
Yeah, it's so fascinating how that knowledge kind of gets warped between the scientists and the journalists. So can you talk a little bit about like harm and how the meaning of that has changed in scientific and medical research related to queer identities from its, I guess, when you're going back as far as the 50s to now?
Yeah, I think thinking about the changing definition of something like harm is a great way to see how science is never this totally objective thing that's happening outside of human perception and goals and interests, but rather is extremely kind of beholden to its own kind of context and time. And so to kind of see that in action, we can think about what harm used to mean at the advent of modern sexual science. So we get those like this German physician, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who writes in the late 19th century about homosexuality being perhaps a nervous system disorder. Von Krafft-Ebing is rather sympathetic to gays and lesbians, actually, and thinks that there should be some reforms made so that folks aren't put into kind of prison or otherwise oppressed for their kind of desires. But nevertheless, he sees this as kind of a biological disease. He thinks it's caused by modernity and the stresses and other kind of dysfunctions of modernity. And so he thinks gays and lesbians are harmed in this respect because their kind of nervous disorders are out of whack. We also see kind of the American ego psychoanalysts who are very prominent in the mental health professions in the early 20th century. They're the kind of ones who pioneered what we call conversion therapies, or so-called conversion therapies. The preferred nomenclature is change efforts, to emphasize that conversion is kind of something that's not actually done in this setting, and that therapy implies that there's any kind of medical validity to what's being done in those sessions. But so these early psychoanalysts are pioneering these conversion therapies, and they're doing so to treat the harm that they see homosexuality does to their patients in their lives, and to society kind of at large. Society is harmed when folks are able to persist outside of kind of normal human sexual desire and the nuclear family and kind of everything that goes along with that. But then today we have a very different conception of harm, and that is we have all sorts of studies, and we talk about them in this way too in our kind of just our day-to-day discourse, that the harm we're concerned with is what happens to queer people when they encounter things like social oppression and denials of civil rights, but also scientifically in the realm of science and medicine when they're exposed to something like change efforts, or when the law denies them gender affirming care, as so many youth now are kind of subject to these laws increasingly in the States today. And so that harm becomes something like suicidality and trauma. We care about the individual and their identity. It's a very different kind of conception of harm than we used to see. Although I should kind of close out here by saying that we also see this older notion of harm still lurking and becoming actually more prominent in discourses about trans identity today. And that is, we see Wall Street Journal reporter Abigail Schreier and others like her promoting this very fringe clinical idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria. And that is, there's something about our society and maybe social media and untreated mental illness that is causing harm to susceptible teenagers in particular, who then take testosterone or have top surgery rather than getting, as Schreier and others would say, like the actual help that they need. And so we see again that kind of that notion of harm. It can change, and it could change again in terms of kind of what we're concerned with as a society.
Oh, that's super helpful. I want to ask you about, so the Born That Way and maybe thinking about different directions we could have gone. But before I do that, could you just explain, because I know I see Anne, who's a Canadian, I am too. Maybe some people might not know this particular draw of immutability arguments and U.S. civil rights discourse, like why advocates might have felt like they had to say gay identity doesn't change, just for people who, for Anne. So Anne won't mind me pointing her out. Okay.
Sure thing. So this idea of immutability became very important to equal protection law. And that is, making sure that laws follow the 14th Amendment's provision in the Constitution that says that the laws must apply equally to everyone, regardless of identity. This is added to the Constitution immediately after the Civil War, and applies to kind of the rights in that period of the newly emancipated people. And so this idea of immutability actually comes in much later. It's an idea that we see first in 1973, when the Supreme Court hears a case concerning sex discrimination. And in that case, the Supreme Court held that sex discrimination violates the Equal Protection Clause because sex is an immutable characteristic determined solely by the accident of birth, I think is the exact language. And so that's 1973. This is about 15 or so years into the modern gay and lesbian rights movement's work. They are already fighting in federal courts at this point. And they see this decision in 1973 and they say, oh, if sex can be an immutable characteristic determined solely by the accident of birth, maybe sexual orientation can also be deemed immutable. And to their credit, immutability pops up in the 2015 marriage equality ruling that Justice Anthony Kennedy writes in Obergefell v. Hodges. And he says, in part, that gays and lesbians deserve the right to marry because it is their immutable nature. He also adds in another part, he says it's their immutable nature to have families and to have children. So there's a very kind of resuscitating like the family and glomming the family and the nuclear family onto gay and lesbian identity itself. But that's kind of, we see immutability becomes something that's kind of very powerful in the law, and advocates see that they can use born this way kind of ideas to then achieve civil rights.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's super helpful. And so we have this born this way, what now clearly is a trajectory, but back, are there roads that weren't taken? Like, could there have been other ways of moving forward in terms of, instead of relying on science to legitimate our identities?
Yes. So there have always been in gay and lesbian rights advocacy arguments against born this way. In particular, actually, they start off being less arguments against born this way, but arguments against the idea that science and medicine should have any authority when we talk about what it means to be queer. And so we really see this kind of in the immediate aftermath of the 1969 riot at Stonewall in New York. And we see the rise of this organization called the Gay Liberation Front. There are many others like it, but it's the most prominent and it has national chapters. And this is very much like a New Left organization. And it joins the New Left women's rights movements. It joins the New Left students movements, anti-Vietnam, all sorts of kind of what are deemed these kind of New Left causes. And the gay liberationists join the New Left by saying, not only like the women's activists, that patriarchy has kind of warped our sense of what it means to be individuals and has given these kind of scripts for what it means to be a man and a woman. But the gay liberationists say that the whole binary we're constructing around homosexuality and heterosexuality is actually false. It's socially imposed the way that patriarchy is socially imposed. And they kind of crib on Freud and Marcuse to say that we need to explode the binary and live this kind of polymorphously perverse future where these kind of identity categories won't even make any sense any longer. And I love to quote Gay Liberation Front co-founder Martha Shelley here and her kind of rallying cry. She wrote, "We want to reach the homosexuals entombed in you, to liberate our brothers and sisters locked in the prisons of your skulls." So this is very much not kind of we're a naturally occurring minority alongside the straight majority, but rather we want a total kind of sexual and cultural revolution. So the Gay Liberation Front itself kind of crumbles in the first few years of its existence. So it's hard to say that this is a road not taken to Born This Way because they're relatively powerless when it comes to political institutions and kind of advocacy power. But the idea stays alive that this kind of suspicion of saying that homosexuality is a naturally occurring minority and that we should use science to understand what it means to be queer. We see this pop up in kind of small activist groups even through today. Definitely becomes kind of a staple of queer theory, and the academic kind of seminar room is really where I think this idea goes to live beyond the Gay Liberation Front. But I should also kind of close by saying that despite all of this kind of exploding binaries, and maybe it sounds like I'm saying they didn't think that identity categories were meaningful culturally or politically, they were actually very beholden to their identity categories. So a lot of these activists would say, for instance, that you can't adopt a bisexual identity because adopting a lesbian identity is going to be the catalyst to changing society writ large. And so there is still an emphasis, you know, you have to say you're gay, you have to say you're a lesbian, you have to reject this socially imposed kind of straightness and kind of anyway. And of course, there are also a good number of anti-trans ideas that proliferated in these groups. There were ideas that trans women, for instance, were kind of engaging in this kind of offensive adoption of oppressive gender roles and inadvertently kind of supporting the patriarchy in doing so. So a lot of different kind of ideas that are not exactly born this way, but have all of their kind of own hangups and problems themselves.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I was just teaching about gender ideology today, and like one thing that strikes me about like the gender ideology crowd, well, not us, the anti-gender crowd is like they have a unified theory of gender. Like it's upside down. It's like ideological. It's like yeah, ideology is like right but wrong. It's upside down. Like they have a coherent view of gender in terms of like, you know what I mean? Like they understand that queer rights, trans rights, feminism, women, they understand it's all together. And we are just siloed. We all have our own narratives about identity and we fight back like separately. So I just always think that's really interesting. And one of the things that I really appreciated about the book was the right is so smart. I mean, not to compliment them, but like they used to really go all out on choice. Or they're just they're just this choice thing. They could choose to be straight if they really tried. And but they've shifted, right? They have shifted their strategies in terms of arguing against LGBTQ rights. Like what other avenues have they decided to follow instead of just saying it's a choice?
Yeah, I agree that they're actually the ones who are kind of pushing against conversion therapy bans for minors and pushing for gender affirming bans today are smarter than sometimes I think we give them credit for. And they're smart because they realized a little while ago, and I'm talking here about groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which has this $100 million annual operating budget now. And if you think of anything evil that's happening to queer people at the Supreme Court, the ADF is probably nearby it and has been for a long time. But so those like the ADF were starting to realize that their experts that they were bringing into court to testify against queer rights were starting to be deemed quacks, and that they needed some other kind of authority, some other kind of power to push their agenda. As kind of born this way became increasingly hegemonic as an idea, as evidenced in that Obergefell opinion from 2015. And so they do a variety of things. A lot of these are based in competing rights frames. And so that is, we see, I think folks are probably familiar with Jack Phillips of Masterpiece Cake Shop, the Christian baker who wanted to deny queer couples a custom wedding cake. He's making free speech and religious liberty arguments against doing so. The Supreme Court finally sided with a similar case last term, a similar case to Jack Phillips that dealt with a website designer. These groups are also inverting the idea of the right to privacy. And so we tend to think of conservatives as opposing the right to privacy because it was at the foundations of Roe v. Wade and protections for abortion in the Constitution. But the ADF and other groups realized that they could say privacy is important to, they wouldn't call them cis women, but to cis women's rights, and that trans women and giving trans women any sort of rights to restrooms, locker rooms, homeless shelters, etc., would violate cis women's hard-won privacy rights. And we see a lot of litigation on that front too. So they do this competing rights thing, and they also try to foment scientific uncertainty about the kind of undergirding science and medicine of gender affirming care, for instance. And so what they do is that they use this kind of case, excuse me, from the early 2000s, where the Supreme Court said in an abortion case, actually, if the state can show that there's some kind of scientific uncertainty in what they're legislating around, so that was kind of abortion procedures was the topic of that case, then the judiciary will kind of give deference to the state regulating that territory. And so now the ADF and others are trying to say that gender affirming care is too uncertain medically in order and thus that states should be allowed to have these gender affirming care bans for minors. And just notably, I said there's a tie into abortion, but the ADF and these other groups also have some incredible industry ties too. So we see a broader attack on the idea that there is any scientific certainty to vaccination policies, to policies that would help regulate the climate, that would kind of combat fossil fuel emissions. So this kind of goes all the way to the most powerful millionaires and billionaires who kind of exist and run politics in our society.
Okay, so we have Born This Way, and we have like, I certainly, we have Born in the trans world, we have Born in the Wrong Body kind of narratives, and we have but now we have a whole like pluralism of narratives. Like we have people who are gender fluid and non-binary, and it's all about fluidity and moving around. So it seems like with the newer generations, especially, who aren't attached to like old boring acronyms like or like gay or transgender, we're moving away from the born that way sort of narrative. Is that happening, or what's going on with that? Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's complicated. I think the answer is kind of yes in some ways and no in others. So a couple of years ago in the journal Pediatrics, there was this really fascinating study that showed that 9% or something like that of high school students in this Pittsburgh school district identified as some kind of gender diverse. They had some kind of gender diverse identity. And this and other studies are pointing away from this long-standing Born This Way assumption, really, that there was some naturally occurring percent of people who were gay or trans in society, and that there was no danger of everyone suddenly kind of rejecting gender norms and adopting kind of fluid and flexible desires and identities. But that does seem to be kind of less the case, and maybe in a more tolerant society, folks can experiment more with these things, and maybe it is kind of liberatory to them in a personal way to be able to live their lives in different ways. And I say that Born This Way is still kind of exists in some important respect because we often don't hear the logic that I just gave, right? We don't hear the idea that maybe this is allowing people to live in ways they never would have before, but rather that the new environment that's more tolerant is allowing for a kind of activation of a latent Born This Way identity. And so we see kind of advocates say things like, well, in a more diverse, tolerant world, people can be who they always would have been. And now they have the language to say who they always would have been. And so I think that's a kind of backdoor essentialism. And they're not saying it's biological, but there is this idea that we always would have been one way, and now we are kind of able to live these identities and desires in this new context. And this is kind of despite the fact that this is actually not how biologists even think about what it means about the relationship between organisms and their environment, right? This is not an especially tenable idea. And so I say all this because I think we need to navigate this new reality of kind of blossoming different kind of identities and gender expansive ones. And we need to kind of not let conservatives win the day by saying, they're the ones who say trans identity is a social contagion, it's spreading. It's this idea that it's a menace and it's a bad thing for people to live outside of these constrained categories. When rather, I think as progressives, we could actually take that narrative and do something with it and not let the right just kind of run with it.
Yeah, I mean, what I really like about your this is the book for people who haven't. This is it, a very lovely cover. What I love about the book is how you're very understanding and familiar, and in some sense, a part of identity politics. Like it's a loving, familial critique. You know what I mean? But you're always moving us to think in like larger, broader directions. Because I am just we get, especially I sort of focus recently mostly on trans stuff, but we get so caught up in these ontological battles about who's a woman, and it's like brilliant on the part of the right. I don't know if anybody's seen that right-wing documentary called What is a Woman, but 120 million have, and if you haven't, people, you're not among the 120 million. But it's I forget, it's a right-wing group, and Matt Walsh is in it. And he just goes around and he asks academics like, oh, what's gender? What's woman? And I think some of these gender studies people didn't realize they were being set up. And they give him very thoughtful answers, and they're very nice. But if you have to talk for 4 minutes to say what gender is, like we've been pulled into their territory because we just become like, oh, eggheads talking complicated things, which I know what sex is. And we get drawn into talking about ontology and who is a woman and who's a man, and politics drops out of it. Because what your book does a really good job of showing is like, let's look at like the larger political economy and the scarcity that's happening that is somehow kind of propelling a lot of these movements. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about a different way of doing politics other than focusing so strongly on identity and immutable identity.
Definitely. So I appreciate that you see the book as this kind of, I think I called at one point, celebratory and cautionary tale, right? Trying to give credence to the victories that have been won using this strategy, and real ones too. I think we would be kind of remiss to say that we haven't won extreme kind of civil rights victories and victories for social tolerance, even in the last decade and few decades. But at the same time, the kind of cautionary element of the book is that Born This Way presents a very particular, very constrained way of doing politics. And it's constrained in the way that all liberal pluralist advocacy movements are constrained, or sometimes folks will call these identity politics movements. And that's because they're based on a few assumptions. One is that there's some kind of linked fate. Here it feels almost like a biologically linked fate. And that is that all folks who are trans, for instance, have some sort of shared collective fate with one another. I actually think that things could get pretty bad for me and a lot of people, and they wouldn't get that bad for Caitlyn Jenner, for instance. So I think that there is kind of a flaw to that idea that in an incredibly heterogeneous, politically and in important ways, kind of classed kind of categories that we arraign around people, kind of erases those important kind of distinctions. And then also liberal pluralist movements are bogged down by the fact that they are mostly beholden to wealthy donors and corporations. And so I've walked into national queer advocacy conferences before, and I'm just hit all of a sudden with pharmaceutical exhibitions. It's Gilead, right? And we can see that there is a real limits to what a movement can do when it's kind of supported both by the idea that the kind of class interest of Caitlyn Jenner is the same as my class interest, is the same as a poor working class trans person's interest who maybe can't afford housing. And also this kind of particular donor makeup. And so I think that means that these identity-based advocacy organizations and the Born This Way idea that kind of coheres them together are extremely inadequate for addressing the wide variety of things that the majority of queer people who are working class or poor in this country actually need, such as not access to healthcare, but actual healthcare, like a national healthcare system, and public housing, and investments in public housing, and all sorts of social kind of public goods that are really kind of out of the scope of these liberal pluralist advocacy kind of movements. So I think we need to kind of break out of that kind of mold of what it means to do LGBTQ plus politics.
Yeah, what's so fascinating to me with the identity politics, and I like the old fashioned formulations with the Kobahi and Barbara Smith, but it's been so switched around that like actually we have to do politics. The idea that your identity produces a politics, like that takes work and commitment and being in a collective and figuring things out. And like identity politics, the way it's conceived now is just like too much of a shortcut, and then they get disappointed when gay bankers don't support the national health care plan. Of like, well, no, because we have to do that politics. Just because they're gay, they're not going to necessarily have the right politics. So I just think that's so important. So I think we have time now. We can open it up for questions. So if you type your questions in the chat, I will read them off. But while people are thinking about questions, I wanted to ask you, Joanna, because I've been, I try to read. I read a lot, and I keep talking to students, and then I keep reading things about this thing, transness, and it's so interesting to me. I keep asking them, and they just look, huh? But like, these students are so smart, they could recite Judith Butler backward. You know what I mean? They're way beyond Born That Way, and they're way beyond like immutable arguments, and yet there's this kind of thing bubbling to the top of like they call transness, and it seems like a new way to kind of like try to consolidate like some sort of similarity across all these different people. Have you heard that term?
I actually, I think I have. I haven't
Yeah.
heard it out of my students, but I confess that I couldn't give much of a definition for it, but it does sound like an interpretive intervention to salvage what they like about
Yeah.
the identity equals politics formulation without
Yeah.
saying, yeah, right, you're saying trans identity, no, transness, as if it's something meaningfully different when you have to go and fight politically.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like it seems like it's a desire to have some kind of collective identity, but why not just do some work together instead of give it a name? So, um, but there's lots of things. Anybody had any questions? There's lots of possible things we could you could ask about because Joanna knows everything about born this way arguments. If anybody has questions, I don't think. Oh, wait, let me see if I'm missing anything. Oh, I see one. Good. Sorry, I was pressing the wrong button. Okay, Kelsey asks, what could you tell us about how the history of gender transition medical care plays into Born This Way? Is the born in the wrong body narrative set up conservative anti-trans efforts?
It's such a fascinating, question. The history of gender transition care for folks who are familiar is itself very fascinating. It emerges in a very institutional way in the mid 20th century in response mostly to intersex patients, but then quickly becomes applied to in part trans, or rather kind of gender non-conforming youth who then psychologists and psychiatrists feel like they have to mold in some way, right? And some of these early forms of gender kind of diverse care actually just kind of look more like what we would think of conversion therapy today. And they're not conversion therapy all the time in the social conservative register because there's an assumption that a gender nonconforming boy is actually gay, right? And there, we can see that this is a kind of popular notion for a long time and still in many circles today that gender nonconforming mannerisms and desires are actually at the heart of what it means to be gay. And so there's a very kind of smooth transition from I'm not understanding my gender to the kind of sexual orientation category I can kind of fit in. And so I think that it has some kind of clear parallels with some of the Born This Way studies, which also make that kind of argument that, for instance, to be a gay man is to have higher estrogen levels and lower testosterone levels. There's not like a clear distinction in a lot of these studies and the way they're discussed by scientists between what it means to be gay and kind of what it means to be trans. And I think that eventually we do see that kind of born in the wrong body discourse become one of the most popular ones. And now we're up against a wall with the Abigail Schreiers of the world who tell us that if we're not fitting this kind of typical pattern that scientists have given us in the literature, then something new and terrible has happened, right? Now we have this fringe idea rather of rapid onset gender dysphoria.
Yeah, and that's well. Let's want to move on to the next question. Thank you, Kelsey. Okay, Heather asked, I'm interested to hear about whether you think there's a salvageable role for civil rights law here. I think we've seen the obvious limitations of the courts, and they're even more limited when they are, for example, psychiatric experts on the right. But what would be a good or more inclusive legal strategy as opposed to just a political one? Like, how do we combat experts on the right and stop them from winning the day?
Oh boy, is that not one of the questions of the moment? I think that some of the answers, at least from my perspective, are maybe disappointing to some. I think that it's power politics, and so you have to change the judiciary. Biden has made some efforts to do that, but has been slowed down in others. And you at least have to have a playing field that's not totally conservative judicial appointees. Now, you also probably need more than the appointees that the Biden administration has been choosing, which have their own kind of, many of the folks who are now sitting on the federal bench have kind of corporate backgrounds, have prosecutorial backgrounds. And so there's a real limit to what the liberal coalition is willing to put on the courts as well. And then you have to fight the kind of big money of the conservative legal movement, which just every day ProPublica has new horrifying news on that front, right? I think we've all kind of seen that. So I mean, I think the context has to change. I think the balance of power has to change. And that all aside, I also think that there's just going to be a limit to what can be done in the terrain of litigation. The pre-1950s versions of the civil rights movement for African American rights in this country had a much clearer sense of what could be done with civil rights law and what couldn't be done. And that's because they had more of a labor union kind of base to their politics. And so they had that kind of building class power in order to make demands on the level of what we saw during the New Deal, when labor unions won the vast array of things that we have today, like Social Security. And so I think we need those kinds of movements and that kind of orientation to politics beyond just this idea that if we just build a better ACLU, we'll realize the world that we want.
Right, thank you. All right, so Scott asks, in a human rights world, when it was a bit more flexible, we used to toy with the idea of sorry, Scott, I can't say your big words, analogizing, you know what I mean? So sexual orientation and gender identity to religious belief. Something that was important to the construction of selfhood for many people, that was clearly mutable, but that no one should be compelled to change. There are many reasons this never took off, but I wonder what you folks think of this as a model that doesn't exactly transcend identity, but doesn't make it natural or immutable either.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me of the fact that when we started to see immutability really proliferate in litigation in like the 80s and the 90s as the gay rights legal movement grew, there was an early decision from a Circuit Court of Appeals justice who said that, look, immutability itself doesn't mean biological, kind of in the same register that religious belief is immutable in an important respect because it's clearly not biological. Immigration status is also something that's pretty immutable, but we don't think about immigration status as being biological. And so his kind of word of advice to the queer movement at the time was, you don't have to sell us on the biology, which is going to be uphill. Because there were a lot of folks who could read the studies and could say, maybe it's not saying born this way, really, right? Maybe it's not actually giving clear evidence of immutability. So I think that there have been judges on the federal bench who have taken that idea seriously throughout this period. And I do wonder if the religious belief parallel could have taken off. I think it's still a question of like what kind of litigation work you're doing. And so you're in that kind of narrow constraint, but you know, maybe it could have taken off in a different universe.
Yeah, actually, Scott, yeah, I found this interesting too, because I think I wrote an article once saying we should not make an analogy, won't turn into word, make an analogy between like, gender expression and religious expression. But it's like, it didn't really resonate, but I think litigators tried. So there's this case, Lane versus Eastern Airlines. This woman comes back from her taking time off to transition. She's a pilot, and Eastern Airlines just fires her. And so I laugh because it's so terrible. The court says, oh yeah, they could totally fire her. And they said Eastern didn't fire her because she was, they said, born a man. They didn't fire her because she's now a woman. They fired her because she changed from being a man to a woman. And the litigators were like, well, you wouldn't fire someone for changing from being a Buddhist to a Christian. That would be like religious discrimination, but it didn't take. And I think it's because there's certain kind of common sense stuff around gender. Just people weren't ready for that, but maybe they would be at some other future moment. But I have another question, because I always think of Ian Lopez's book, White by Law, where he looks at the racial prerequisite cases in the early part, the early part of the last century, where the Supreme Court had to decide who was white and who was not white for the purpose of non-discrimination law. And like they loved science. They would, in a racist way, they would like find all the science, phrenology, terrible stuff to say who is white, who is not white. And then Franz Boas comes along and anthropology, and the scientists were like, oh yeah, race isn't really a thing the way you think it's a thing. But the court didn't say, oh, bad on us, we won't do that anymore. They just turned to, as Lopez points out, they just turned to different discourses, which are like the dictionary or common sense. So when science didn't do what it wanted, they found other dictionaries, which suggest other forms of authority for their opinions. So I was just thinking, like, this is just apropos of our discussion, like the court, I think the Republican move sometimes is just a common sense, and that turns into a political question. Like, what do you think? How can we deal with those kinds of strategies?
Yeah, it's a fascinating parallel. I do think this is part of the pathology of thinking that the most clever argument is going to save the day. Because at the end of the day, you're fighting in the terrain of litigation. You're fighting kind of these, and you're fighting against common sense. You're fighting against what is common sense at the time. And so there were litigation making the parallel to disability around the same time as well, and that gets incredibly fraught in terms of kind of intra movements and advocate discussions. But there are all these kinds of parallels and let's see if I can say the word, like analogies made. I had to gear up for that one. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, I think the book is more taking kind of a snapshot of the discourses that occurred as a result of doing a particular kind of politics. And I think some of those discourses could have been a little bit different on the edges, and we could have had more or less born this way arguments. As we're seeing today, we have these backdoor essentialist arguments, or even this transness idea, and all of those ideas take a kind of cultural essentialism to the same project. So I think that there are contingent reasons that biology is at the kind of base of LGBTQ plus politics today. But again, that was contingent. And it's more kind of what is the politics that gets produced, I think, is at least the interest of mine in the book.
All right. Any more questions? I don't think there were questions. I don't see any. All right, Joanna, do you have any last words for us then?
Just that we have all the answers.
We have all the answers.
No, I'm just so grateful for Greenlight for putting on this event, and I'm so grateful for everyone who was able to join us tonight. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I was so happy to be able to do this, and I see a couple of people, some people I know on the participants. I sort of missed the old Zoom. Remember the beginning of the epidemic, and it would just be a free for all of everybody being on there, and you could see their faces. But now I understand it doesn't work that way. But well, thanks everybody for Oh, there's something from Anne. Not a question, but an observation. I really appreciate how both of you are focused on the idea of what is produced by these kinds of immutable thinking. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you. I think that is exactly, I think what I think it is our shared project. I think it's if I'm not mistaken, I think it's kind of also at the heart of Sex Is as Sex Does, your book. It's, it's not so much the theory, it's what's the goal? What are people trying to do? And then the discourses and ideas kind of follow the goal.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. And there's information about how and where to buy Joanna's book. So always remember to support your local independent bookstore. Greenlight is ours. So and I'll pass it back to Jessica. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I always feel, I'm sorry, I'm like crowding into the Zoom space,
Yeah.
but what a fantastic conversation. I took so many notes. You guys are brilliant. I really appreciate getting to listen to you tonight. Thank you for coming into this virtual space and for all of your thoughts. Again, the links to buy the books are there in the chat. We are also going to be posting the recording of this event on YouTube, and we'll share that link so folks can revisit the talk later on. So thank you guys so much again, and have a great evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.